Y'all ready for this?
The following dialogue will be delivered at extremely high speed, so you're going to have to be paying very close attention if you want any of this to make sense. There will be helpful pictures along the way.
Let's talk language, kids. What is it, you ask? But not really, because you're a bunch of high schoolers, so that never actually happens. Language is a complex phenomenon governed by 3 rules. It's creative and open-minded, meaning there's more than one way to write a sentence. It's intended, so in the most technical sense, no one has ever said something involuntarily, ever. And it's rule-governed, meaning that you can't scramble eggs the dog swimming. What does that mean, you ask, as if I'd answer?
No.
But instead, I will deliberately misconstrue that question so I can explain theories of understanding instead. The denotation theory, basically if you got a meaningful word, it stands for something. Like, for instance, the word rutabaga. Sounds like gibberish, but stands for a thing. This thing, to be exact. So, rutabaga is a meaningful word. Snarbruden, on the other hand, stands for nothing, so it's a meaningless word. Just like Micklesmuth. While that's all well and good, it's got a bit of a problem. What does truth stand for? It's highly likely that you just thought something along the lines of stuff that's truthful. Either that, or you're still caught up on Migglesmuth, the scrambled eggs dog about 2 amorphous paragraphs back. Or maybe you just like a clear-cut meaning, which brings us right along to the definition theory. Definition theory makes the dictionary your best friend. Makes it great. Defines language through more language. That means if you look up a word like incredible, you get a bunch of words like amazing and fantastic. Problem with that is basically this. Flower, see colored blossom. Colored blossom, see flower. Get it? See understand. Now that you're thoroughly confused, here's a Pegasus. And the image theory says that you know it's a Pegasus because I said Pegasus and you saw Pegasus. Unfortunately, we've all got a lot of different ideas about what exactly a Pegasus looks like. So while you can see this, somebody else sees this. And the worst bit is, since it's all in your head, you will never know what it is they are associating with your word. So language has got issues. More specifically, the knowledge kind of issues. Please enjoy that masterful subject change. For instance, language is ambiguous, which means a lot of stuff can get lost in interpretation. Words sound the same, but mean different things. Someone uses a metaphor and the listener takes it literally. There's a ton of ways for the language train to crash between point A and point B. That's why you need context when trying to interpret something. For instance, if I just use the term their butt, a lot of things come to mind. I could be saying, their butt ugly, or their butt is so huge, OMG, or their butt for the grace of God, go I. There's a lot of their butts out there, so you need context to tell them apart. I'm having trouble with this segue, so I'm going to give you a moment here to breathe and enjoy this picture of another way we get a meaning out of words is connotation. And that's basically how the word makes you feel. Let's try it, shall we? Alright, feminist. See, you all probably thought this. But what this really is this. And that's connotation. Live it, love it, crush it. Own it. But where does connotation come from, you don't ask? Well, to answer your non-existent question, connotation is simply the repeated use of a word in limited context. Speaking of limits and context, which we're not, if you have words to distinguish this from that, then people are likely to go around distinguishing this from that until everyone is in a tiny little box they don't really fit into. Then people start labeling the boxes because repeatedly seeing those in a box in a limited context will lead people to come up with a connotation that goes with the people in a box that doesn't actually make sense because you'll only ever see them in boxes. What? Now you've got stereotypes, another issue with language. But where do they come from? I totally just answered that. Fine, this time it'll make sense. Let's start how all stereotypes start, with a label. There's a black man. He oversees a group of prostitutes. You label this man a black pimp. There's another isolated group of black men. They are pimps. From this sample of evidence, you begin to formulate a view on the whole. Whether it be extrapolating that all pimps are black, or backtracking to the theory that all black men are pimps. It's not necessarily true, but that's your first impression. You'll be damned if you change it just because you meet a few anomalous black men who aren't actually pimps. Now, if that's a problem with language or a problem with people, that's up to you, but language makes it happen. The next problem is a little bit more language-oriented, though it remains a question of use. You see, weasel words make everything unclear, much like this video, but more on purpose. They equivocate in an attempt to pretend that something meaningful has been said, when really only vague statements and ambiguous claims have actually been communicated. Basically, they're qualifiers, like, sort of, like, possibly, mostly. It's possible that I'm mostly done with my EE. Then we have things that are unclear in a way that is supposed to convey more meaning, which totally makes sense, and is so not at all like this video. What I'm dancing around here is poetic language. You know the stuff, metaphors, idioms, irony, personification. Now, unless you just walked into the classroom for giggles, you know exactly what all of these things are, so we're not even going to bother explaining them all to you. We're just going to pose this question. Does poetic language help or hinder understanding of language? Well, it really depends on how you look at it. If you like your language dry, cut, and literal with very little room for interpretation, then poetic language probably isn't your deal. if you like how language is open and interpretive and often inherently emotional, you're probably already into poetic language anyway. Now, language is cool, we dig it, and unless you communicate entirely through punches and nothing else, you probably dig it too. And while dig it may be a cringingly out-of-date phrase to use, in this language we at least know what it means. In some languages, there is no translation for it, and so those poor people will never understand what it is to dig something, and so they never can. Unless, of course, they learn English. At least according to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, in which two dudes that had names rhyming with Mapir and Dorf came up with this theory that language decides your world. For instance, in some Micronesian dialects there is no word for exercise, so they have a serious problem understanding why anybody would just go running for the sake of running. So while to us running is like this, to them running is like this, and that's not the same. Anyway, we're done now, so here's the credits.